Well, this is our second talk on Heracles. Only we're going to do something else first, to get at what we want to get at, and we might even mention Heracles tonight. There were two brothers. One of them was very rich, very worldly wise, and very nasty. And the other, the younger one, was poor, and he was amiable, kindly, and somewhat simple. So we have our old business again. This is going to be all review almost. We have the two brothers that fight again. And here we have the old one being sort of ugly and sort of an attitude that the older represents the past, obviously, and that's bitter, whereas the younger represents the future sweeping into the present, and that always seems sweet. There's always a possibility that something can come out of things. Well, one Christmas, the poor one, as is often his case, just can't seem to make a go of it, and he comes to his brother, and he asks his brother for help, because he's destitute. And the brother, representing the past, represents a worse state of humanity, and he feels duty-bound to help his younger brother, but doesn't do so with eagerness. He says, I will give you an entire flitch of bacon for a favor. And the younger one agrees and says, all right. And we have the present feeding off of the past. Everything we do now is a result of what we've done before. That if we haven't done much before, we won't have many capabilities now. And the strength that we have now, the fuel that we have now, is all a result of what we've done before. And the older brother goes to the smokehouse and gets the flitch of bacon and gives it to him and says, now go straight to hell. And the younger brother says, what I have given my word to do, I must stick to. In short, he's got to go to it. There are obviously some very simple worldly wise lessons in here. Don't agree to something until you know what it is that you're agreeing to. But what's really beautiful about this is, and I find it more important every day, and that is when you have decided in the course of doing something, and when I say to myself, I'm going to do this or I'm going to do that, you've got to have the conviction to just never let go and never quit and be willing to go to hell if necessary. So he puts the flitch of bacon over his shoulder and he starts walking. And he goes on for what seems an endless, endless distance. And just that evening, he comes to a place where there's an unusual looking house or building, and a little ways off is a pleasant old man with a white beard who is chopping wood for the Yule fire. It's sort of a Santa Claus or an Ancient of Days or something like this. This is a really interesting story because this one has all menfolk in it and no women. And he goes up to the old man and he says, good evening. And the old man says to him, same to you. Where are you going so late? And the young man says, to hell if I only knew the right way. And the old man is even taken aback by it, and he says to him, well, you're not far wrong. But when you go in, they'll ask for your flitch, since meat is very scarce in hell. And just don't give it up. go in the house there, and that's the place you're looking for, but don't give it up except for the little cairn which is behind the door. Again, we have the whole notion of the insignificant item, the little piece or the thing that most people would overlook is the thing. And this is kind of unusual that he finds his way right to hell, and it's not unusual for a hero or a heroine to make their way to hell. It seems like everything that we do, in every act and in every type of virtue we try to lead to, we have exposed the negatives in ourselves that we have inclined ourselves toward using that same virtue. And that an initiation into goodness is automatically an initiation into evil, because they both come from the same source, and since we have been specialists in the negative side of things, we've taken every virtue and made something negative out of it. And it's not surprising in another way, because when one is ready to be a hero, the things that other people miss, even those little insignificant things like the cairn behind the door, the spiritual student finds their way right to it. That's poor grammar, but what I'm trying to say is, if we really are intent on attainment, if we really are intent on union with God, what we need and the passageway, which usually goes through hell, it becomes not obvious to us, but it becomes immediate to us. We dead reckon, we incline ourselves, and we're just drawn there. But at any rate, the hero knocks, just like there's a knock on the door of heaven, there's a knock on the door of hell, and he enters, and he's immediately surrounded by a swarm of hungry devils. They're unusual devils because for some reason they don't have the power of just stealing his flitchered bacon, and so they all want to make deals with him. And they promise him almost anything, which is the way of devils. They promise you almost anything because they know if you take even anything, you're stuck. The whole spiritual path is not the process of taking on more things, it's the process of getting rid of more things. And the more things that we hang on to, the more we're going to be weighted down. And finally he says, I won't take anything for this flitchered bacon but the little cairn behind the door. And this strikes panic in the hearts of the devils, because they try to do anything to dissuade him. I'm sure there are lovely women and everything else in there. He's married, but not to a not too pleasant lady. She's kind of harsh on him. I know that there is a woman in here. He does talk to her. But at any rate, they're hungry and they desire the meat. That's probably what constitutes hell, all of this desire for things that you can't attain to, that probably aren't good for you in the first place. And he gets the cairn, and he gets outside, and the old woodcutter tells him how to use it. And so he sets off at a very stiff pace, and he ends up arriving at home exactly at midnight on Christmas. So this is obviously a very spiritual kind of story. It is a true Christmas story again. It takes place right at the most holy moment of the year. And his wife begins to berate him and everything else. And she says, "Where have you been?" And though he may be simple, and though he may not be the most intelligent, his heart is good, he does have forbearance and discretion. I guess he must have learned that with regard with regard to being with the devil, and he answers in a rather circumspect manner, I have been here and there, and for one thing and another, which is true. He didn't say exactly where things were. This is the way it is for the initiate, because truly what we're talking about when we're telling these stories, the universal language is mythology, or mythology are the last remnants of a universal language. Because in the spiritual worlds, before we fell into the material world, we lived in a universal cosmic consciousness. And in that universal cosmic consciousness, we saw things in whole, and we saw how everything was tied together. And what we saw, that those truths which have so many sides to them, have become the stuff now of the stories of myths. And it has to be that way because the truth is so universal that you just can't say it out like you say out history. This happened, and then this happened, and this happened, because there's too many sides. Another reason is that when one experiences the inner worlds, even if it's a hell-like state, what one experiences is, in terms of this world, ineffable. It's not a matter that you'd want to profane the spiritual worlds by talking about them, but it's just a matter that you can't. If you do, you recognize that everything that you try to say outright becomes nothing but does nothing but present more difficulties. You just can't say it. And so you have to be circumspect. And another reason why you have to be circumspect is you would never divulge things that are sacred. But on the other hand, you would never lie. On the other hand, you would never, this is a Briares with many hands. Briares, the giant, had 100 hands. We may even get to that myth sometime. But on another hand, you couldn't actually talk about your spiritual experiences, because if you talk directly about your spiritual experiences, it would be sort of like the worst kind of name dropping. But what you can do is you can beat around the bush, and you can give hints, and those hints usually lead people on. But she continues berating him, and he figures, well, something has to be done with this, and he gets out the little cairn, the little mill, and he puts it on the table, and he says, grind out this goodie, and grind it out good, and grind it out fast, and starts grinding that out. And he knows all of the right words. The words are, for starting the mill, grind out whatever you want, and grind it out good, and grind it out fast. But he's the only one that knows the word that stops the mill. Yeah, Karen, yeah. No. Okay. But at any rate, he makes this fabulous feast, and he has a big banquet for everybody in the neighborhood because he's generous, and everything that before were curses, everything that he now does is a blessing, and everything that he now does is fruitful, and he can have whatever he wants, but he only usually wants it to help other people. And eventually he develops a great reputation for generosity and wealth and everything else, and goes around the whole countryside. And his brother comes to visit him. And his brother says, where in hell did you get your wealth? And he said, behind the door. Sometimes it is that way with the truth. You can say the truth outright, and the secrecy is not because you're trying to fool anybody, it's just because they can't see it. If you remember that's a myth that I most certainly want to study, and that's the myth of Oedipus, as told in the play by Sophocles. Throughout the entire drama of Oedipus, everything that's going to happen to him and who the bad guy is, he knows all the way. He said again and again. It's so obvious in front of him that you know how it is. That's the way it is with the spiritual truth. And so he can say things exactly the way they are, and in no way harm anything, or no way divulge anything. But eventually his brother bugs him, and I guess even the hero can't stand being bugged, and so he gets off the mill and demonstrates it, but is very careful and not to let loose of the secret word that stops things. Now, finally his brother begs him. He said, I did you all of these favors when you were poor. Lend me the mill. It's haying season. I have all of these people to feed, and I'm just a poor farmer. Now it's your turn to help me. And so he loans him the mill. And while the hayers go a-haying, the brother sets it up on the kitchen table, and he says, grind out herrings and broth, and grind out both good and fast. First thing you know, there are herrings and broth coming out. And he fills every kettle in the house, and even the wash tubs and everything else. And no matter what he does, it won't stop. And pretty soon the whole house is flooded with herrings and broth. And he has to escape, and he does so, making a great commotion. And eventually his brother comes to the house and redeems the mill and frees him. This is sort of the way things are. The stuff of life, which is what initiation is all about, or what the heroes are all about, it isn't that if you're aspiring spiritually, you're not aspiring to a different world, or to a different life, or to different stuff, or different powers than anybody else has. It's just that you learn how to use them better, and that you learn how to use the spiritual powers that we all have in the service of divinity. And, it's so what brings bad luck on other people brings good luck to the people who brings whatever they want to the people who are in control of themselves and who are working to divine purpose. In this case, it's obvious that it is a due curse that anybody that would like to eat herrings, that would command the can to run out of herrings, deserves to be flooded in them. But at any rate, he eventually, the younger brother takes the mill back home, and eventually he becomes very famous for his wealth and for his generosity, and even for the little mill, because people begin to understand. Now, there is this sea captain who is extremely, extremely wealthy, and like many wealthy men, he wants to have something that nobody else has, something that he thinks will make him richer. He still wants to continue shipping and bringing around valuables and such like that, only he can only carry so much stuff on the ship because he has to carry salt, because everybody has to have salt to eat. And so he comes and he pleads and pleads and pleads with the younger brother, please rent me the mill. And the younger brother makes sure that he has a big stock of everything that he'll need probably for the next several lives, and he rents him the mill at an exorbitant price, prepaid. And so the captain rushes off, and he learns how to start it, but he forgets to even ask for the stop word. And he gets out to sea, and he's way out at sea, and the sailors want salt. So he gets out the little mill, and he says, grind out salt, and grind that out both good and fast. And so it starts grinding out salt. However, he finds himself in great difficulty because he can't stop it from grinding out salt. And it continues to grind out salt and continues. And pretty soon they're shipping water, and the ship sinks, and the mill goes down to the bottom. And obviously even the simpleton, with all of his abilities, can't go to the bottom of the sea to talk to the mill. And that's why the sea is salt. It's because the cairn is still down there pumping out salt. It's a worldly wise little tale. It has morals in there about how you should live and being circumspect and all of that. But actually, this is a folk version of a very high, profound myth. And it's a myth that we want to look at because it bears relevance to one of the ways we're going to look at Heracles. There is a mill that at one time used to grind out blessings. It used to grind out everything that we wanted and everything that we needed. Now that mill grinds out nothing but salt, bitter salt, and it won't stop until the last word is heard from the guileless one. There is that old saw that goes, the mill or mills of God grind slowly, but they grind exceedingly fine. This, we're familiar with the lost word. We've discussed it before, the lost word of masonry. All of the lost words that were words of power were at one time, we even used to have magical abilities. And the lost note that would free us. We lost the creative word, and now we are trying to gain it back. And with that creative word, we can have the mill grind out something else. That mill is actually, it is nothing other than the wheel of destiny. It turns and it grinds on and on and on. And at one time, before the so-called fall, before we tried to fight against the process, and before we tried to make ourselves exclusive of the process of creation and destiny, we used to have nothing but joy. And the millstone, or the mill wheel, is none other than the zodiac. It spins and it turns and it turns, and as it turns, new things come out. But since we've been sinning, nothing but salt comes out. Now, that wheel, like many wheels, mill wheels, sits on a fulcrum, and the ones that humans make, they're enormous big stone wheels, and they often have oxen or something like that, or somebody like Samson turning the wheel. Remember the story of Samson when he was tied to the wheel? Well, Samson is one of the people of the wheel. The fulcrum in there is what it spins on, but according to this myth, occasionally the fulcrum gets out of the socket and the wheel wobbles. Now, strangely enough, this is not only the myth of the mill wheel, it is also the myth of the maypole. You know what the maypole is? It's a pole that's set up vertically. Maids go a-maying, and there are usually ribbons of various colors that are tied to the top of it in different directions. Probably to be true, there are 7 different colors. And what happens is the maids go a-maying, and they have their baskets of flowers, which they throw flowers out, and they hang on to the, I think this may even be a lords and ladies kind of thing, that young men and women both grab onto the end of their ribbon, and they sing the May songs, and they throw out flowers, spring flowers, to the audience, and they dance around the maypole, and as they dance around the maypole, each one has a different color, and they wrap up. And their ribbons become something like a barber pole, stripes on a barber pole, only each one is a different color, and as they get shorter and shorter, soon they get closer together, and it's a festive, loving Maying time, and there is the kisses of May and all of that sort of business. It's the same story. It's the story of a reunion. Now, the maypole is another way of looking at something that we've talked about before. It's none other than, if this is the Milky Way out here, or that is the superlative heaven, the maypole is nothing but different than the ladder of the gods, where the lowest rung is the moon, and then Mercury, and then Venus, and then Sun, and Mars, and Jupiter, and then Saturn. They're strung out sort of like the maypole. They are the ones that move faster, are closer to the Earth, and when you get out here, you have Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, which rule the crystallium, the firmament, and the primum the unmoved mover. These are the purely spiritual realms out here. And this is very appropriate, the ladder of the stars, because this shows the ascension to the spiritual realms. It begins with overcoming your low base biological nature, and it ends up that before you can become one of the gods, you have to get so far that you're beyond destiny, so that you make no mistakes in destiny, and that you can use the creative forces that are associated with the truly spiritual realms and with the octave planets. Then you belong to the gods, and you have climbed the ladder, and you are free from earth. Now, this is a most interesting way of looking at it. Now, this takes place not only on a ladder above the earth, but it actually takes place in the earth itself. We have this snake here. If we look at the earth and put the maypole on the earth, or the, let's do this the right way. Alright, if this is the earth, this is the equator. The ladder of stars begins with the moon. And then the next belt is, on the earth, is Mercury. The next belt is Venus. The next belt is Sun. The next belt is Mars. Next belt is Jupiter. And finally, the polar region is ruled by Saturn. Probably the magnetic field around the Earth that is so strong at the poles is ruled by Uranus. And then the interplanetary and interstellar space is ruled by Neptune, which rules the sea. And then the ultimate depth of everything, when you're beyond it all, we say that's ruled by Pluto. So, the mill, the fulcrum of the mill, obviously is the pole of the earth, because the houses, which is where we have our experiences, this is the equator. The houses, which represent the fields of opportunity where we have our destiny experiences to grow day by day, are a consequence of the earth rotating on its axis, such that if we take any given location and divide it up into 12 sectors, as the earth turns, different star patterns or a different environment is behind those spokes of the wheel or behind those sectors. So Saturn then rules the pole, and so you might say this is Saturn's mill. And this is saying that, Saturn really is the Lord of Destiny. And if this millstone is the millstone of destiny or the mill wheel of destiny, it's just exactly the way we would expect. Before we can leave the earth and fly off into the spiritual realms, we have to have completely overcome everything else of the earth. It's interesting about all of this that all of these Orionian and Neptunian people, there are a lot of these notions about the earth being hollow, and that when you get up at the North Pole, that you can crawl right inside of the earth and it's hollow there. Some people actually believe we're on the inside and that the poles is where we can get to the outside. I even met a man once that he seriously told me this. He says, do you know, it's this German bull, because the Hitler people believed in this theory. He says, do you know, if you have a big well that goes way in the ground and you put plumb blobs down that well, he says when you get down there, they're farther apart at the top than they are at the bottom, and that shows that we're on the inside of the earth. No, he was getting around. They're farther apart at the bottom than at the top, meaning to say that we're on the inside and that they radiate out like this. And so he had the most unusual emotions about that. But it is true that in some ways this is climbing, going up the latitudes is like climbing the mountain just as much as climbing the ladder. And if you look at a lot of the hero myths of the very great heroes, they keep going to higher and higher places until they get to the place like where you can read what is the thing that if you read the Ramayana so many times in one day, then you become a saint. And the only place where you could read the Ramayana that many times in one day would be at one of the poles, because the day would be very long and you could read through that enormously long poem in that time. And the etheric atmosphere is very powerfully charged there. It's so powerfully charged there because of the field of the earth. And very reputable people, not just New Age wackos, but people like Admiral Byrd actually claimed that there were unusual phenomena there. And so people start unfolding an etheric clairvoyance, and they start seeing into the earth. And they start seeing through the different layers into the spiritual realms. That's not what we want to talk about, but I just want to... So what we're talking about here then is that, looking into the earth, there is that great underground treasure called the Agartha. And this is the place where Dante goes down into the earth layer by layer by layer. He goes into hell and then he comes out the other end. In fact, he even has, at the other end, he has the North Purgatory is at the South Pole, and after he's gone, climbed into the earth and come out the other end through the center, he rises up Mount Purgatory and eventually into the true heaven worlds, which are shaped like a great big rose and such like that, and his girlfriend sits on either the right or left hand of the Virgin Mary. I don't mean to be too cynical about it. But at the North Pole is sort of like the head of the earth, and that's where the Christ influx comes into the earth. We leave our body through the head, at least the white magicians and the initiates into the right-hand path enter and leave through the head, and the dark path leads through the feet. And this is truly a Christmas story in that regard, that there is something that does come that brings all kinds of great goodies and that frees us from being tied to the mill. Now, in the Norse, where this folk story comes from, among the Norths there is another name for Saturn, and that is Amlodi. And the character of Amlodi is dark and brooding and melancholy, and from this source is where the character, it doesn't take too much work to Hamlet. The story of Hamlet is the story of Amlodi. And this brings us to a really wonderful, wonderful book on mythology, if you would like to read it. It's called Hamlet's Mill. It's a much different kind of rendition of mythology than what you'll hear here. But Hamlet's Mill was written by Giorgio de Santillana. I'm not sure if that's how it's spelled. And I think that's how it's spelled, Herta von Dacian. He was, for many years, the dean of the historians of science in the world. He was at Harvard, and Herta von Dacian was at MIT. And they got together. This was his parting shot to the world. When he retired, he published this book. And the thesis of the book is that the ancients were not stupid. The ancients were every bit as intelligent as we are, only they just spoke a different language. And what he does in this book, among other things, he takes the character of Amlodi or Hamlet and ties that character together with Samson pulling the mill wheel and all of that. And he ties together myths from all over the world, and he shows that they are part of a language that is where the myths are tied together in a historical fashion by the precession of the equinoxes. As the equinox precesses backwards through the sidereal zodiac, there is, you might say, a zodiacal, there is like a whole moon that passes with it. And constellation after constellation after constellation, or ribbon of constellation after ribbon is exposed to the zodiacal point, and so all of the myths are tied together in that historical way. So there are two different kinds of mythology. One is the type that we're more or less looking at it in a very unsophisticated fashion compared to the mystery students like the Platonists, where all of the myths are tied together in one story, is tied together with another one, and they cover the whole of the universe almost like a grid work, or an internal grid work like a skeleton around which all of the life of the cosmos is built. The other kind of mythology is as a delineation of these myths, a delineation that is brought about by history. And that is the kind of mythology that is brought out in Hamlet's Mill. It's almost always in print. If not, you can get it, I'm sure, at the university libraries. Now, what we've been talking about, we've been saying that basically all myths of heroes or heroines are solar myths, because the true hero is the self, the spiritual self, the divine nature, self with a capital S. And that self is synonymous with, if not identical with, self through which everything is created, as they say in the early Hindu creation myths. And so we're looking here at the sun. Instead of rising and falling, we're looking at the sun as the ox that, instead of pushing the stone up the hill like Sisyphus, we're saying that the self is what drives the mill wheel. It pulls it and turns it around and around and around. And it's really interesting in this because if we take, there are 7 here, that means there are 2 extremes. There's Saturn and the Moon and the middle planet. And the Holy Spirit, developed in the Moon period, is associated with the equator. With the temperate zone is the Christ, or the life spirit, developed in the Sun period. And at the extreme is the Father Time, Saturn, developed the divine spirit developed in the Saturn period. And so we find that the extremes of materiality, which are associated with the Moon, and the extremes of spirituality and almost a cold, isolationistic kind of objectivity, that they're met or balanced again in the temperate or the median zones, where the cold air coming down from the pole meets the warm, moist air that comes up from the equator. And this is really a rendition of we may even talk about that next year, the creation myth that is associated with the Norse. Oh boy, I think the area from the equator going north is called Muspelheim, and the area, the cold coming down from the north, is Niflheim, and where they meet they produce steam and all of that sort of thing. That's a little off of where we're wanting to go. We're talking then about the turning of consciousness. We're talking about the turning of the wheel. And this turning or spinning relates to states of consciousness. That as things change and as we change relative to our environment, even if we just seem to stay in one place and spin, we're changing in that process. Now, there are 2 ways we can look at this mill wheel, Hamlet's mill. We can look at it in forward motion through the zodiac, which is like following the sun as it goes sign by sign by sign. That is associated with a symbolic process, that the hero conquers one thing after another and symbolically represents a path that we are all taking. That symbolic path is associated with the inner worlds. The other way is we can look at the signs of the zodiac backwards, sort of the way that the folks in Hamlet's mill do. And that's not symbolical, that's historical. And that relates to the wobbly earth and the eccentric earth, and that represents the realms of imperfection where we live here, and the kinds of experiences that we get out of making mistakes. And obviously the whole procession of the equinox itself is completely dependent on the earth. On the sun there's no precessional effect. So it's a geocentric phenomenon, and it can't be any other way. So we're going to look a little bit tonight at the precessional, the backwards kind of movement, with regard to the labors of Heracles. So we're now, remember we spent 1 week talking about the birth of Heracles, and then we talked about his youth and how he went crazy and killed his own children and things like that. And he can only redeem himself by redeeming his sins, by doing these 12 labors. And he has to do these 12 labors by being farmed out to the father of his twin brother, which is supposedly not his own father. Because we went into that myth before, no reason to go into it again. And this is the most irksome person in the world, the person who took away his kingship. He now has to go and serve him. He gets his nose rubbed in it. So we're now ready to talk about the labors of Heracles. And the labors of Heracles and similar feats were called among the Greeks pathos. They meant a feat or a labor or a trial or something like that. Clearly, derivated from this is where our word athletics comes from, athlos. So, we're now ready to start talking about them. There is pretty much among everybody who has ever written historically about the 12 labors, there's pretty much agreement about what the 12 labors are. That's a commonly agreed thing. There is not always complete agreement about the order of which came after which and which came after which. In the ancient world, there was even more disagreement. That had more to do with partisan politics, the order of the labors in the ancient world, because everybody wanted certain labors in such and such position to be associated with their place of residence. Actually, we're going to find out they take place all over the world. Fortunately, I checked with all of the greatest scholars, or who are considered the greatest scholars of the 20th century, and all of the greatest scholars of the 20th century agree as to the order of what the 12 labors are, and that's fortunate. What's really most important is which one. There are two, just like where we begin in the ladder of stars and where we end in the ladder of stars are really the important ones. So we're going to look at the first ones and the last ones as being the most important, and the median ones in between we're going to look at it in a different way. The amount of time that it took to perform all the labors is also uncertain. Most people agree that it took 1 year. And when we begin, it takes almost 1 year to tell all of the stories of the 12 labors. You'll find that out in the next couple of weeks, in the next 3 weeks probably, that it takes that long. I think the reason that they had it as 1 year rather than as 12 years, because like a lot of other things, they were, these forestalling of the Trojan War was 12 years, and a number of other things. How long did Odysseus go on to the seas? Do you remember that? 20 years? No, one generation on Saturn, Jupiter cycle. But there are a lot of those things that take place 12 years also. This has led to a lot of speculation. A lot of speculation that each of the labors are associated with a sign of the zodiac. I have chosen not to look at it that way. Even though I have spent a long amount of time, and I don't know all of the little nuances and details of mythology, and especially of stellar mythology to be able to dig it out. But the claim is, like, a lot of people have made connections between the 12 laborers and the 12 signs or 12 constellational areas of the zodiac. If you look, most of these involve animals, and if you look, there are 12 divisions of animals with horses and boars and birds and things like that in there. Isaac Newton, the famous astronomer physicist, wrote much, much more on spirituality in alchemy and mythology and the Bible than he did on physics and astronomy. However, they don't publish that so readily. But he had a treatise where he tries to show very clearly that the 12 labors of Heracles had to do with the 12 signs of the zodiac. Maybe if you're Newton that becomes obvious, but it isn't to me. Supposedly the precursor to the Heracles myth, the Gilgamesh myth of the Akkadians of Assyria and Babylon, is very obviously associated with his feats are associated with the 12 signs of the zodiac. But we're not going to look at it that way, basically because it would involve a lot of research which I don't have either the time or the material or the resources to go into. If somebody would like to sponsor me for about 5 years of not working, I might take on the project, but I don't see any hands raised, so I'll just continue on. And the most important reason we're not going to look at it that way is because this is not really this is not really meant to be an astrology class or even a mythography class. It's more of a class on mysticism. And we want to look at some of the mystical things involved with the athlos and see what we can get out of that. But you do recognize that in all of this, that this is if you put together all of the sections where we've talked about the zodiac, like in Perseus and last year in Isis and Osiris, you have a wonderful, wonderful vehicle for a spiritual kind of star lore that you could focus on the heavens, and you could go out every night for a whole year, and by focusing on them, you would have insights onto what to meditate on in your spiritual life, to be fruitful and to be right exposing yourself to the light of the stars, because the stars are indeed the bodies of gods, and the collections of them, the constellations, represent whole fields of high spiritual consciousness and hierarchies. The first labor is the Nemean lion. Second is the Lernaean hydra. The third one is the Carinian boar. No, the Carinian hind. The two together. The fourth is the Erymanthean boar. The fifth is stables of Augeas. The sixth is the Stymphalian birds.
7th is the Cretan bull. The 8th is the mares of Diomed. I've been reading these books on the 12 labors, and some people are really terrible scholars about it. Hippolytes' girdle, the 9th. The 10th is the cattle. Geryon. The 11th is the apples of the Hesperides. And the 12th is Kerberos. The Hound of Hell. Now, there are many, many, many ways that we could treat these. At least I could have that kind of fun with it. But it's extremely complicated, and many of the stories are very long and complex and eclectic, and there are a lot of exciting topics. We're going to look at them in the order of occurrence, but we're going to look at them in clumps or bundles or bunches, and they won't necessarily all be the same size. And we're going to look at them in various ways, because we're not just trying to tediously enumerate all of the myths and carry out interpretations to the far end in a dry fashion, but we're trying to look at myths and develop tools so that when we run into any story, our friend's dream, or if we travel somewhere and somebody, even literature, reading a novel, or encountering any story, how we can relate it to our own spiritual lives. Everybody's life is a living of this in some ways. We're going to look at the myths in terms of the vehicles of consciousness and the vehicles of evolution. We're going to look at the athlos in terms of methods, that is, the techniques and ways that we have within our consciousness to unfold spirituality. And we're going to look at them in terms of objectives or in terms of purpose. And in that way we will look into order, why some things are at the end and why some things are at the beginning. So there is a reason for the long introduction that we've had tonight about the Wheel of Destiny and all of that, because it fits in very nicely to the first 3 labors of Heracles, and they relate to the zodiac in a reverse fashion, which has to do with the history of spiritual unfoldment, which has to do with work rather than in the symbolic forward motion, because in the symbolic forward motion everything seems to be so easy. Now, actually, from the spiritual point of view, it is in almost everything else, it's a replication of the creation. Our spiritual lives are miniatures of the entire creation of which we are part. And in the same way that the first breath that we take indicates our work for the entire life, because it relates us to the cosmic environment. That first breath, that first action, determines our pattern for the entire incarnation we are living through. The same is true with the path of initiation. The very first thing that is done is the most important. And in this case, the first labor of Heracles is the labor of the Nemean lion. And the Nemean lion must obviously relate to Leo. Now there are a lot of ways that Leo is important as the beginning of the zodiac. Actually, you can have the whole zodiac begin with Leo, because it represents the first light. The ancient Egyptians did things this way, and if you look at it, there is a heliocentric structure of the zodiac, even in geocentric astrology. If you take Leo as the first act. If you take the cusp of Leo as the beginning of the zodiac, Leo is a positive sign, and that represents the diurnal light. It represents the center of the zodiac. Looking back then, the negative sign represents the moon, which is the nocturnal light. If you take one sign out from the center of each of these, you have Virgo and Gemini. And so you have the sun in the center, and the closest thing to the sun is the mind. And you have a reversal here. To the right hand is the negative mercurial sign, the nocturnal, and the diurnal is Mercury. The next thing is the higher emotions associated with Venus, and you find so you see what we're doing in the structure of the zodiac. So you have the light in the center, and the first thing out is Mercury, next thing out is Venus, next thing out is Mars, next thing out is Jupiter, the next thing out is Saturn. So, and they alternate in diurnality. This is just another variation of this other 7 planetary system that moves in here. But, okay. So this represents the first step, or the central step, in one way. There are a lot of other ways that we can look at it. The way I want to look at it is a way that is very Western and very Occidental, even much more Western than Egypt. And that is to go to another old maxim or another old saw. And that, the one we talked about earlier, is that the mills of God grind slowly, but they grind exceedingly fine. The one that I'm interested in is very Western, and in the West it is said that all occult development begins with the vital body. Meaning to say that when we develop our etheric constitution and have the ability to transfer our consciousness from the physical to the etheric, that is when the first occult development begins. The word occult meaning hidden. In this case it means hidden because inner, and because we have our eyes focused on the outer world, we really can't see the inner things. The true hero is within, and our true nature is within, and our true work is within. Even though we do outer works and we can brag about how much we help and do this and do that, the true work is really within. Because even the outer work falters or it becomes useless if we don't do it with a true degree of sincerity and a concentration that is unadulterated by selfishness or anything like that. So, we have previously talked before We talked about when we left off the last time we talked about stargazing, we talked about Perseus. And we looked at the myth of Perseus, and when you see Perseus in the night sky, the best time to see that is in fall. But in spring, when the sun comes into the area of Perseus, it is the springtime, and that's when the hero arises and overcomes the things of the earth. We said that this made a relationship that is shown in the zodiac, that the personality and the outer is indicated by the first house and the first sign and the first constellation, whereas the spiritual individuality hidden within is indicated by the seventh house, the seventh sign, and the seventh constellation. We said then that what we ponder in fall, when the spiritual season is coming on very strong, becomes manifest in spring. And that it takes at least a half a year for all of the solar part of our constitution to come right outwardly in the external world. The same thing applies in the precessional cycle. We've looked at it before that what happens in the evening determines the way we're going to be in the morning. We've talked about what happens in the fall comes right in the spring. And we say that the inner work that is done in the fall becomes the outer work in nature in spring. Now we're going to look at it in a different way. We're going to say that the individual work is balanced, that is, the microcosmic work is balanced by the macrocosmic work. And in order to do that, we're going to let's look at some things in the zodiac as they relate to this. Opposite of Leo is Aquarius. Opposite of Virgo is Pisces. Opposite of Cancer is Capricorn. Opposite of Gemini is Sagittarius. Now we come into a very, very profound kind of astrology. In this profound kind of astrology, there is a relationship with a hierarchy, with a whole outpouring expression of spiritual beings that are associated with a realm of existence. And when they're associated with that, that means that it is their primary responsibility. Associated with Pisces is physical world. Wherever there is this kind of matter that is outward. And macrocosmically, the divine hierarchy, or the gods that are associated with Pisces, are humanity. That's the way it works in the exoteric, in the outer work. In the esoteric, we find it much more, in our current astrology, we find it in the sixth house. The individual physical body is associated with Virgo. The Aquarius is associated with the ethers. And all of the things that come into being in that dreamlike way. Aquarius is associated with dreams and wishes, and things are accomplished through the etheric hierarchy by dreams and wishes. The beings that are associated with Aquarius are current angels. The opposite side of Aquarius is Leo, and that has to do with our vital body, which was developed in the Sun period. Capricorn relates to the macrocosmic desire world, the universal desires. That's why it's more associated with grand ambitions and honors and things where you have prestige in the world. It's the desires that raise one above individual seekings to a more universal seeking. That there's such a thing like you don't want the petty stuff. You want to be a great person, a giant person yourself. Associated with the desire world are the, you almost leave that there, archangels. Opposite of Capricorn is Cancer. And that really is the individual desire body. Our personal little moody feeling area where, which was developed in the moon period. This is our own personal little realm where we do our own individual work with the with the principle of desire, or with the principle of motivation, or the principle of feeling. Sagittarius represents the universal mind, or mind stuff, or the higher mind itself, or the cosmos. Associated with that are the lords of the mind, which are sometimes called archai, or archai, myth builders. Opposite that is Gemini, which is our lower mind, personal mind. And so we see that this part of the zodiac, from Virgo through Gemini, is our very, very personal state of existence. It is where we are doing our own individual work. This relates clearly, the way we're looking at it, Leo relates to the Lemnian lion. The Lernian hydra relates to Cancer. I don't know how to pronounce it again. The Carinaean boar. The Carinaean hind relates to Gemini, going backwards, since a circle always wraps around itself. This must be the dog of Egypt associated with Virgo. That must be the Hermanubis, the dog of the underworld, Kerberos. And so we see the labors of Heracles associated with the development of the personal individual vehicles. Now, the Kerberos is considered the hound of hell. It guards the underworld so that nobody can get into the underworld and get the riches of it. If we look at that in one way, it's the same thing as saying, if this part up here, if the signs Aries through Virgo represent the summer months when we're out in the world and care about the world, and the sun is in the northern hemisphere. Then the southern hemisphere, Libra through Pisces, represents the underworld, when things were the realm of death, when everything dies. Therefore, to get into the underworld, you have to go past Kerberos, which has to say that even before the spiritual work begins, you have to come to terms with your physical body. You have to be as faithful as the hound of hell. You have to be as true and honest. In some ways, it was the angel that was the one that led the heroes into the underworld, but they always had to face Kerberos. So the first thing, unless we develop, let's look at some of these things in astrology. Virgo has especially to do with sensory data. In fact, if you take Mercury and put it in the opposite sign house, you have somebody who's likely to be deaf or mute or have sensory deprivation of some kind or another. So this is saying that the more we use our physical body truly, especially the senses in it, and garner as much as we can from the physical world through service. Obviously, the service has to begin before we can begin the esoteric work, which begins with the Nemean lion. Now, that's like saying that in some ways the last labor of Heracles, the labor of Kerberos, is actually the first one, or is the beginning in one sense, because it prepares the conditions. There is no way that anybody is ever going to be initiated in any school of any kind unless they show a willingness to serve and help and redeem and save the world. There has to be that recognition, that watchdog recognition that things aren't right, and they have to be corrected, and work has to be done. There is not a single myth of a hero that after he has proceeded into the underworld and has done all of his trials and developed all of these powers, there's not a single myth that where he says, "So long, Charlie, I'm taking off. You guys can steep in it and have your bad old time." In every case, the hero is a savior and does this for the sake of other people. And so preparatory to any of the labors at all of any hero, one has to be thinking about other people and has to be doing it as an action of service. So that's where we begin with that's the preparatory work. Next time, we're going to begin talking about the Nemean lion and the lion skin. We're going to try and take all three, the Nemean lion, the Lernaean hydra, and the Carinaean hind, and do them all in one shot and tell the stories and point out the development that takes place in our inner consciousness. But we have to remember that if there is no service, if we don't do something, there's not going to be any lion skin. There's not going to be doing that, anything of that. And in that kind of activity, we have to be as faithful as Kerberos, who never let anybody get by him. Well, a few people tricked him every now and then, but those are other myths, and we'll talk about the meanings of them. But you see what you can apply this to your own horoscope by looking at the houses, by watching as the sun proceeds through the houses, or when the sun is opposite of any given house, how you can guide your own, the same thing that we're talking about by star lore and by understanding myths, you can apply to your own personal horoscope, or you can apply it to worldly works. And we're talking about a star lore, a stargazing as a guide to a spiritual life in such a way that you can work with the world and with your own character as it is developed in this life, and how you can help and how you can serve by putting this information about the precession together with the information about that we talked about in the Perseus talk, and together with what we talked about in the Isis and Osiris talks. You see unfolding a whole modern 20th century kind of star lore or star guidance for unfolding the spiritual life. And it's a great way to work on planning your life. All right, so next time we'll start talking about the Menelian lion. And we talked almost nothing about Heracles. We mentioned his name a few times, but said actually nothing about him. But sometimes you've got to get things out of the way first before you can actually go into the stories. In other words, we're likely to get too caught up in the stories and all the lovely little things that are in the stories and miss the bigger kind of work that we're trying to do. What? Yes? We are in the solar zone. We are in the solar zone. The exact middle, the 45th meridian, the 45th parallel passes through northern Wisconsin. No, yes, we would. Yes, because this is temperate. And this has a mixture of summer and winter. When you get up into the Arctic zones, when you get way up north up there, it's almost all winter. There's some riotous spring there, and there's some riotous growing. There's extremism there. Saturn always seems to concentrate everything in natural phenomena. You put anything together with Saturn, and it becomes much more concentrated, whether it is a low pressure or a high pressure caused by a given planet. It's much more concentrated by Saturn. And the same thing, like if you go down to the tropics, you go into that lunar area, or even going up into the savanna belts, there things are, it's all summertime. Here we have the extremities of both kinds, summer and winter. And this is the best of all places to be. Yeah. Yeah, I was talking about the reflective process being reflected into the concrete mind. All you need is half the size and you've got them all. You've got it all. And scoop like. All right, that's it for tonight. Thank you very much.